So I think 20, 30 seconds. We will start.
Do you still have to give me back control, or do I still have
Yeah,
it?
I will give. I will tell it. I will tell it. I made a short introduction, and I will say I will switch to you,
Okay.
and
So
then
then I would expect to have something that I need to click on. So, okay, fine. We're
yeah.
good.
Okay, here we go. Goedemiddag, van harte welkom bij het vervolg van de webinarweek, de allereerste dag. En ik ga nu overswitchen van het Nederlands naar het Engels, want onze volgende gast zit momenteel in Las Vegas. So I switch to English, and the next presentation webinar we will get is from Gerry Crispin, and Gerry is at the moment live at Las Vegas. It's 4 o'clock in the morning, so we're very thankful for having him at this moment to join our webinar week. Everybody who we will switch within some 1 minute. We will switch to Gerry. If you got questions, you can do that by the orange button, the orange arrow. So if you got questions, I will follow it, and maybe I will ask Gerry within the webinar to give some answers on questions. And at the end, we will also answer the questions for Gerry. Also, you can use the hashtag webinar week on the social media like Twitter and Facebook. And there will be a replay of it, will be available. You will receive it tomorrow through email. So Gerry is founder at CareerXroads and also co-founder of the Candidate Experience Award. And that's nice. He is a lifelong student of recruiting. So I think that's very nice. You are never too old to learn something. We're glad to have him here. Gerry, I will switch to you and have a nice webinar. And I will speak to you at the end of the webinar.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me all right? And
Yes,
can you
we can
see
hear you.
and you can see my screen all right?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, for all of you who have joined this webinar, I'm truly honored to have the opportunity to present a little bit to you about the journey that I'm on. This is an area that I am very passionate about and have spent a good deal of time during my career being concerned about this issue, but very pleased these days that we're in a position now to share some pretty strong data. And over the course of the next 45 minutes, what I'd like to be able to do is tell you a little bit about myself, so that just for a couple minutes, so that you understand where I'm coming from. But also I'd like to be able to share with you that there are statistically now about 5 practices that take into account about 80% of how you would be rated by your candidates that you are looking at. And there's an implication here, and the implication is strong in terms of your ability to continue recruiting, as well as some implications for the performance of your corporation as well. And so we'll get into that as we go. I will tell you there's 3 companies that I'm heavily engaged with. One is CareerXroads, which you see that logo in the top left. The Talent Board oversees the Candidate Experience Awards, and that's a nonprofit. It does make money, but it does not use that money to benefit the people who are involved in it. So it's totally supported by donations and sponsors. And a new organization that will start in about a month called ATAP. It is the Association of Talent Acquisition Professionals, and we'll be starting in about a month with over 1,000 members. And so there's some information there that you may be interested in down the road as well. So as we look at this subject, I really want to tell you that I spend probably the majority of my time during the course of the year working with about 100 companies. These are members, and they're focused in on sharing with one another key practices. Some of these companies are probably familiar with you, and some of them are not. But what it does is it gets me heavily engaged in understanding a little bit about what's happening within the talent acquisition community, not only within the United States but around the world. Most of these folks host each other at various times, and that's kind of my fascination with how I work. But there are a lot of things that I do that I think are a little bit off the grid, and so I just wanted to share one or two of them with you. Each year, for example, being an American, most of my adult life, I was not able to travel internationally. And so during the last 20 years, I've had the opportunity to not only travel internationally, but to take time out and go to different countries and live with recruiters and go to work with recruiters. I'm fascinated by the cultural nuances that recruiting brings to that particular profession. And so in places like Brazil and Argentina, Uruguay, India, China, Australia, and this past year, Cuba, and this coming November, I will be taking a delegation of about 20 talent acquisition leaders and HR leaders to Japan, basically to study for about 2 or 3 weeks how work takes place, how talent acquisition exists, as well as human resources. So it's just an area that's I'm kind of passionate about to take a look at. I would hope one of these days I'll have an opportunity maybe to spend some time in the Netherlands and play with the issues around the cultural nuances of recruiting there. Another thing that I do is each year I create a resume, and I spend the time that it takes to put that resume into 100 companies. And I use the list from the Fortune 100 best companies in the U.S. to work for. I do that because it's a singular group that I can do year after year, and I've been doing it for over 15 years. And what I get out of that is the extent to which that application process and subsequent conversation actually supports the idea of how candidates are treated. I use unusual kinds of approaches to those resumes. So one of them, for example, my favorite, was James Nee Cricket, who obviously spent time working in a carpenter studio, worked with a Pinocchio project, worked for Geppetto. And what's fascinating about all of that is that no recruiter ever paid attention to the context of the information that was in the resume or the application, but focused almost solely on the information that was being extracted about James's capabilities. So it was kind of fascinating for me to see the reaction that companies had when recruiters found that James was one of the best candidates they could possibly have. So mystery shopping for me is an activity that every single recruiter should be using at various times, either with competitors or with themselves, to better understand the flow, the workflow of how that information gets to a position where you are starting to make choices, and then how that impacts the first conversations with the candidate themselves. So when I started this, I made the statement that there's just 5 practices that impact 80% of your candidate's experience in terms of how they will rate you. And I'm not going to keep you in suspense and drag this out over 45 minutes. What I want to do is in just a couple of minutes, I want to share with you those 5 practices and then go into a little more depth about how we create that data or get to that point where we're very confident of that conclusion. And to do that, I want to segue a little bit to the issue of the candidate as a customer. It's probably the easiest thing for all of us to think about in terms of a customer behavior, because all of us experience that all the time. Even though most of you, I'm sure, are heavily engaged in the recruiting process, you usually are not on the other side and looking at it from the candidate's perspective as much as you might want to. But every day we're customers. And so this, there's a little bit of a challenge here. I think if you stared at this long enough, you would find all 5 of the practices that I think impact, or that I know impact, the candidate experience. But I'm going to mention 2 of them using this particular slide, and then we can just go to the other 5. The first is the note that you see on this counter. We waited 30 minutes, no service. Obviously, we could infer that this customer was not a happy camper. This customer was a little bit irritated by having to spend 30 minutes waiting for some service and still not getting it. And yet, it's kind of interesting because no matter where I am in the world, if I ask what kind of a restaurant this is, most people will tell me that it is a diner. And if you have any experience with diners, particularly in the United States, you know that when you walk into one, you are immediately greeted by a server. And so the idea of someone going into a diner and waiting 30 minutes when one confronts that issue is kind of crazy. This was a very, very patient person. And what it raises is the whole notion of expectations. There is embedded in us not only the expectations of how we'll be treated as a customer walking into any store, restaurant, or any other kind of retail establishment, in how and when we're going to be treated. And we'll expect to stand in lines in some instances. We'll be told that if we don't know what the protocols are, and all of those kinds of things. The question that we've got to ask ourselves is, how are we setting expectations for candidates about every facet of the recruiting process, from how they research us to how they apply to the whole interview process and selection process, all the way through to onboarding. Without setting expectations for those candidates, they are bringing expectations with them and are very likely to be counter to the ones that are real in terms of what we are going to have. We tend to assume that candidates have clear expectations of what we do, and what we've found over time is that just is not true. It is essential to be able to set expectations, and the extent to which we do impacts that candidate experience. The other practice that I will share with you, we're just looking at this, is if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll notice that someone obviously has been served. And that brings up the notion of the fairness of the practice that we have. When we think about recruiting, we tend from our side to think that we're fairly treating all candidates. If they are qualified, we move ahead. If they're not qualified, we don't. We keep some of them informed, etc. But every touch point that we have can send a message about the fairness of the practice to the individual. And if we feel that we have been treated unfairly, it is the strongest It is without a doubt the strongest connection to how we will be rated and the behavior and attitude of the candidates from that point on. What we've been trying to do for the last 6 or 7 years is seriously collect both stories and data about what is going on in the hiring process from the candidate's perspective. And in so doing, we've basically been able to bring together 5 different factors that we see impacting the candidate experience. The difference between each and every company isn't that the factors are different, the weighting may be different, and certainly the way in which those practices are executed is different and fits the framework of the culture of the company and the culture that they're within. So the 5 practices, 2 that I mentioned, one was fairness. We want to influence in our hiring practices the perception of fairness, especially if it's real, about how our process operates, and that's a critical issue. Expectations, we need to set and deliver them. Listening, we need to demonstrate that we in fact can listen, and most companies don't. We need to make sure that we're accountable in terms of how our recruiters are both measured and rewarded, that what we do includes the treatment of candidates. And finally, closure. Those 5 areas account for the vast majority of how we will be rated, the attitudes that are driven as a result of that rating, and the behavior of candidates downstream. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going out to collect this information. The first issue really is this candidate journey. And I would encourage you, as well as more and more of the companies that are improving the candidate experience, one of the first things that they're doing is seriously sitting down with their teams and taking a look at what they view as the candidate journey, mapping literally every single touch point from attracting that candidate to the application process, the selection and assessment and screening processes, the offer, the disposition and onboarding, all are relative to that journey and have an enormous connection clearly with the engagement of an employee once they're on board. But more importantly, the hundreds of folks who are not hired also have an extraordinary impact on the downstream effect of the performance of both the recruiting process of the recruiters and recruiting function, as well as the performance of the company itself now. We have, in the last 6 years, expanded the collection of data from a few companies in North America to now where we are actively engaging employers in 3 major areas. One NAM, one North America, secondly EMEA, and third is APAC. I will tell you that in every case, in not every case are we fully invested in each and every country, clearly in EMEA. I would love to see more activity in EMEA, particularly in the Netherlands, France, some of the Scandinavian countries, etc. But you can see here that in North America, for example, 242 companies participated this past year in 2016, and they did that by completing a fairly comprehensive survey of all of those touch points that I mentioned before. Once they had done that, they were asked to engage their candidates to complete a mirror survey, and 183,000 plus candidates did so. Out of that, we created a bench of the 50 companies that were rated the highest by the candidates. and we gave all of that data back to each and every company, their data, their candidates' data, and the ability to draw a comparison practice by practice with a bench of 50 companies. This is a set of logos of the companies that had whose candidates rated them highest in 2016. In March 2nd, in London at the Talent, or after the Talent Leader Connect conference, March 2nd, we will be announcing the EMEA winners as well as starting to put the data out for that. I will tell you that a white paper was published on all of the data from the North America 2 weeks ago, and it is available at the website whose link is below, www.thecandies.org. It's about 100 pages. It's a lot of data. I'm going to share a few pieces of that with you now, but I would certainly encourage folks to download it as well as consume as much of it as you can. I do think it'll support some of the key notions that we're talking about here, and we have a research group that's actually quite international that is taking a look at how we increase our ability to distribute this information on a global basis. One of the things that I think is very important, and one of the things that almost any company can do on their own, and I certainly encourage them to do, is to take a look at Net Promoter Score applied not to customers but to candidates. And what that would involve is asking each and every candidate who applies to your jobs at some consistent point, typically within a few days. If it's going to be done well, it should be done within a few days of when you close out a job and have informed everyone that the job is now filled and that they either got it or they did not get it. The question that needs to be asked is this one: given your experience applying to us, would you refer others to consider working there? So that in one variation or another is the Net Promoter Score question that is similar to what is asked of a customer. The big difference in terms of what we've been doing the last 6 years, however, is instead of a 10-point scale, we're using a 4-point scale anchored at both ends. And from that perspective, essentially imagine that about 5% of the people that you ask indicated a 1, or what a 1 means, which is I would go out of my way to discourage others from applying. And just for sake of argument, imagine that 35% were very positive about that approach, about their overall experience, and said, I would go out of my way to encourage others to apply. And those that indicated a 2 or 3, which would be about 60%, you just ignore. Not critical to the discussion. Why? Because when we're looking at Net Promoter Score, we're looking at extremes. So for those of you who are familiar with this, you know there's a bit of an argument as to what is the stability and reliability of this statistic over time. We use a fairly involved approach in the data that we've been collecting now with over 500,000 candidates, and we're pretty confident that this mirrors, for the most part, a sense of health of your candidate experience. So the way in which it's calculated is to subtract the percent that do 1s from the percent that do 4s. That would be a 30. And over the last few years, this kind of gives you a sense of the distribution of that. We tend to look at the top candidates, top employers who've been rated by their candidates. And as you can see, there's a small percentage of them, probably only about 5%, that are really in the upper quartile, and we've been spending a good deal of time looking at them and doing comparisons between them and those companies whose candidates do not rate them well. And so we've got a significant amount of data now, which is helping us to drive several of the observations that I'm now going to make. One of them, this is actually my favorite. We asked the question, was there a relationship between you, the candidate, and the company before you applied? And what's fascinating to me is that pretty consistently, at least in the aggregate, we're finding that about half, more or less, depending upon the year, about half of all the candidates who apply had no relationship with the company, but half had some kind of relationship that was positive. So we were thinking, you know, one of the paths that we've been going down is there a difference in how the relationship perceived before they applied? Does that relate in any way to the outcome? We did not find, for example, that there was significant differences in terms of the number of folks who applied from either side and were hired, and we could adjust and normalize that data, which is what we do. But we looked at, for example, what were the overall ratings for those individuals who were not hired and customers, just to give you one example. So 16% were customers of those who were hired, and this is kind of a distribution of how they rated their experience. And this is the distribution of those who rated their experience. They were not hired and there was no relationship. And you can see that there is a subtle but significant difference between those ratings. And yes, it is significant. But what does it actually mean in the end? And what we're finding, actually, is that the folks who rate their experience poorly and were customers are actually more likely to change their attitude, more likely to take action in the future in terms of not buying the products of that company, in terms of telling other people, in terms of a variety of other things. So the stronger the relationship that you have, the more likely you will be rated a little bit higher. But if you're not rated higher, the activities of your customers and others who have a relationship with you will be much more strongly affecting your downstream approach in terms of whether they will apply again, whether they will refer others, and the extent to which they'll continue to buy products. So we're looking at some interesting changes in practices that ought to be made if you knew that the individual did not have a relationship with you, or if they did. Another observation that we're making has to do with the amount of time that it takes to complete a survey from the candidate's perspective. And this also has some subtle nuances. What we've been finding over the last 6 years is that it's a relatively normal distribution and has not changed too much in terms of the time that it takes. There's starting to skew this past year a little bit lower, but essentially about 80% is between 16 minutes and a year, and an hour, and there's only about 20%, little less than 20% under 15 minutes, and you can see about 12% above an hour. And we wanted to take a look at that, in part because we know that the abandonment rate for candidates where the application is greater than 15 minutes is now accelerating at an exponential curve. And it's doing that because of so many people who are coming to the application process and finding that they are using a mobile device and finding that it's just too onerous to go beyond that. And yet what we're showing here is essentially the candidates that completed the survey. So if you're willing to complete the survey and it took you more than an hour, would you in the end be rating your overall process more or less? And so we took a look at the overall ratings and the distribution for those who were not hired and were able to apply in 15 minutes or less, as well as those who had the overall ratings for those who were not hired but spent an hour or more. And you can see there's some significant differences there as well. So there's some interesting things happening. And obviously this is more and more evidence that suggests that companies need to go mobile. They need to get their applications in less than 15 minutes. And to be honest with you, I'm seeing an increase in the tools that are allowing for, especially with AI capability, allowing for applications in 5 minutes or less. And I think that will become pretty much the standard within the next 3 to 5 years. Another piece of data that I think is going to be increasingly important in terms of looking at whether or not you're putting your company at risk is this question: how likely are you to apply again? And if your experience is positive, you can see that individuals are saying, I had a positive overall experience, and I am 62% say I'm extremely likely to apply again, and only about 0.6% saying definitely not. But as the experience goes down, you get numbers like this. So those with a negative experience, only 5% are likely, extremely likely, to apply again, and as many as a quarter will be lost to you forever. That's a real cost. If you take a look at what the cost of acquiring a candidate is, you can fundamentally start to look at the ROI of what it's going to take if you change the behavior, change the candidate experience. This question, how likely are you to refer someone in the future? Again, extraordinarily valuable to you if in fact you create a positive experience for candidates. As much as nearly 80% would actively encourage others to apply. So you really are getting champions who are basically saying to their peers, I did not get the job in many instances, because about 80% of the candidates do not get jobs, of the respondents that we get. So I didn't get the job, but you may be the one who would benefit the most by getting there. Because of this experience, I'm encouraging you to apply. As that goes down, we see only 4.5% actively encouraging others to apply, and as much as 40% actively working against you. That has a distinct impact on your applicant pool, now and for the future. And so this is exacerbated, obviously, by social media and employment branding. This is the impact on your employment branding. We see also the impact on your sales as well. 41% of job seekers who are negative claim that they intend to take their alliances, their purchases, and their relationships somewhere else. If it's positive, it moves to increase not only your employment brand, but your product brand. So it has enormous power beyond simply the candidate as well. And the impact that it has when you start thinking about sharing with the few closest friends that you have, your inner circle. We find that a positive experience is shared 82% of the time, and even a negative experience is shared with an inner circle 65% of the time. These numbers are double what they were 6 years ago, in part because we believe social media has had such an extraordinary impact, particularly in North America, that more and more people are open, not only with their closest friends, but as you'll see also with sharing their experience publicly, whether they tweet it out, whether they're sharing it on Facebook and other social media tools. 51% share positive publicly, and nearly a third now are sharing negative experiences, or a little over a third. The power of this, being double what it was 6 years ago, has to have an enormous impact on most employers in North America, which is what this is reflective. What we're finding in EMEA and some of the other countries, and I think it differs country by country, we're finding that this is slower to impact on a public basis. So it would be kind of interesting to see how these numbers are reflected within the Netherlands. But what we are seeing is that across all global borders, it is growing at some rate as people become more acclimated to the use of social media. There is one counterintuitive piece as well, and I think this is what's interesting to me, is that the older you are, the more likely you are to share, not less likely. It seems to me that the younger folks get more coaching on not burning their bridges by publicly describing their experience, particularly their negative experience. Whereas the older boomers, the folks in their 40s and 50s and beyond, clearly are becoming more and more vocal in sharing publicly. So some final summary comments on all of these. I talked about setting expectations. One of the questions that gets at that is when we asked, was there anything you wished you knew before you applied? We asked another question, before you were interviewed, before you were accepted, because the reality here is getting at those areas where candidates are now influenced from an attitude point of view because they feel embarrassed, they did not know what was coming, or they had an expectation when you would be getting back to them and it did not happen. It was not delivered. And those are affecting you. 50,000 people, for example, before they applied wanted to know one thing. They wanted to know what the salary was. Can you imagine if 50,000 customers told you that what they missed the most about your product was seeing the price tag? And that's kind of the equivalent. The issue that makes customers and candidates the same also makes them extremely different. Because in most cases, customers are able to purchase the product, and in most job situations, only one of those customers is able to win the product, which is the job. And that is the big shift in terms of our thinking, in terms of what we need to be able to do. One of the things that we've been doing that's obviously been done very, very well, and the candidates are sharing it, is that your ability and the employer's ability to share the expectations of the job using video, using all of the other kinds of things that you can find on a career site, really has been ramped up over the last 5-10 years at the very least, but certainly in a more sophisticated way in the last 3 or 4 years. And candidates are sharing that the expectations about the job are becoming better and better all the time. It's the expectations about the recruiting process that are lagging behind. And so those are things to keep in mind. The listening issue. We asked 25,000 finalists if they were invited to give feedback about their experience. Now, these are the very few people that you felt strongly enough to bring in, to engage, to interview, and one of them you hired and the others you did not. It would seem to me that you would want, if anything, to get the finalists engaged in giving feedback as well as in giving feedback to them, but getting feedback as well as giving it. That is a whole different set of issues. 60% of the respondents for those companies that felt they were doing a pretty good job said no. Companies do not listen when they have something to say about that process. They don't seek it out, and in many instances, they don't provide the ability to do that. The companies that do, that offer chat rooms, that provide emails that suggest that they're listening to them, that provide a link, information about recruiters and how to contact recruiters, those companies, candidates, rate them significantly higher. Demonstrating listening skills is critical. How is the candidate experience and recruiter performance aligned to your firm? Accountability is a key issue. And we looked at companies who did not ever mention candidate experience to their recruiters, left it totally to them all the way through, those companies who were fully engaged in counseling, providing practices, training, and connecting them to rewards. And what we're finding is that when we look at those companies who have the lowest rated employers, we find that they also have the least connection in terms of accountability, with at best informal reviews and no measure of that experience. And those companies that are rated the highest from a quartile point of view are clearly engaged in formal reviews, measuring candidate experience as well as hiring manager experience and other key issues, feeding that back to the recruiters and holding them accountable in terms of their monetary and non-monetary rewards. So we can see increasingly the impact of that. Unfairness is a key issue. I said that it was statistically the strongest connection. There's a variety of nuances here that would take too long to discuss in the time that we have, but I'm going to give you one in particular. We asked questions like, how satisfied were you with the ability to present your skills, knowledge, and experience? And those candidates who answered negatively that they did not have the ability to present their skills, knowledge, and experience either through the application or the screening process or the interview tended to be the ones that were clear that this was an unfair process. They would conclude that it was unfair, whether it was or not. And we found that there is a single question that you can ask in the application, in the screening process, and in the interview that actually has a significant shift in this perception of fairness versus unfairness. That question would be asked at the end of the application, at the end of the screening interview, and at the end of the actual face-to-face interviews during the course of a day, as well as at the end of the day. And that question is what didn't we ask you about your skills, your knowledge, and your experience that would improve your competitive position for this opportunity? Now, I'm sure that the way in which you ask this, within the frame of how you would wordsmith this from a language point of view, is going to be different for different companies and different cultures. But the consistency with which recruiters are trained to do this, the consistency with which this is added to the application, actually has a strong effect on NPS and can change the Net Promoter Score by as much as 5 to 10%. And what it gets at is the willingness of an employer to dig into why the candidate thought they were a competitive candidate, not just what the employer wanted and needed to know based on their research. So it made it much more two-way in terms of being able to do that. And the last, closure. And here I'm using Merriam-Webster's dictionary's definition, and the seventh definition is: a closure is an often comforting or satisfying sense of finality, often applied in sentences with victims, but also candidates. And here it is simply that when the job is filled, tell each and every person who applied. You'd think that this would be a simple, obvious thing to do, and some cultures do it better than others. In some EMEA cultures, it is an obvious thing to do. In North America, it is not so obvious. And is not done as often as it might, but those companies that do that are clearly rated higher. And the longer, in fact, in our last, in 2016, 36,000 people never received any information past the application itself. And even those who were informed that they were no longer being considered, were informed almost consistently with an email that did not allow for the candidate to reply, respond, or share any information about that, which I think is a shame. It is changing, though, and you can see that there are some significant improvements in a variety of those areas. This would have been between 85 and 90% 6 years ago. The last point I wanted to make here is that the amount of time that it takes you to get back to a candidate and tell them they are no longer being considered does impact the rating that you are given. And if it's a few days, a few weeks, that's one thing. When it starts getting into months and you have not effectively set expectations, it definitely impacts the rating and the attitude and the behavior in relation to that. Let's see what we got. So my final comment to you as we end is, I see employers on two paths. One is continuing down the path in which we look at the transactional parts of recruiting and try to improve them with technology. And the second path is taking a look at the relationship aspects of recruiting that impact all of the stakeholders: the hiring manager, the recruiter, the business leader, but in particular the candidate, and better understanding their needs and looking at ways in which through those touch points that we have, we improve that relationship and measure that relationship and better understand its impact on our results from a recruiting process and a recruiting function through to the capability of the company itself. In the U.S., I use this phrase: we are at a fork in the road, and we need to figure out which way we go. But if you seriously look at this issue and do some A/B testing with some of the practices that you think have the most impact, the touch points that are most crucial to the candidates that you serve, I wish you good hunting. And thank you for your time.
Gerry, thank you for being with us. Very nice, all the analytics and stats you brought to us. So if you've got a question, use the orange arrow. You can answer questions to Gerry. Gerry, I've got a question myself. What can you advise employers who want to start with measuring the candidate experience? Where should they start?
Well, I think it's great to get a baseline. So, you know, if you're willing to look in the mirror, even if you think that what you're doing needs a lot of work, rather than spend all your time trying to figure out what you're going to do, doing it, and then measuring, quote, where you are then, that's that new baseline. I'd start with where you are, and I would use that single question that I mentioned earlier, which is to ask them. I would send them an email with a link to a survey with a single question. In the email, I would mention that a few days ago we sent you a note telling you that we closed the position. We care about everyone who has applied. We care about their willingness to come back to us and refer others. So we want to improve the treatment of our candidates, whether or not they get the job. And as a result, we would like you to answer the following question or two. And in my opinion, at least one question should be whether or not they would be willing to refer others based on the experience that they had. And then you might ask only one or two other questions about maybe some aspect that you think obviously might be key. And then you might leave one piece of that open. Is there anything that you'd like to share with us?
So keep it short and brief.
Short, brief, and consistent. The problem is how you automate that. So if you had 100 people apply to the job, you hired one, that means exactly 3 days later, 99 emails should be going out, and you should figure out one of the many, many ways to automate that as a macro. There's a lot of tools out there. There are companies that do this for you, but you know, it shouldn't take more than 60 seconds of any recruiter's time.
I got a question here. It's also about the Net Promoter Score. So yep. What should you do with the difference between the candidates which are hired and the candidates which are rejected? They both
that's a great
got an NPS?
Yes, yes they do. So I think it is very important to know where they are in the process in relation to all of this. So what I didn't share is that we normalize against the natural bump that someone who is hired will rate you. So anyone who is hired, while it's closely, you know, the exact same experience in many instances, it's typically about a 20% higher rating. And so when you get your information back, you want to make sure that the proportion of people who respond to your NPS score, who are hired, and the proportion who are not hired is equivalent. And if it varies significantly, you may need to normalize that data, which any analyst can do fairly easily.
Okay, thank you. Last question, because we're running out of time. Do you see differences in terms of what a positive experience looks in the light of the cultural background of the candidate? So if you've got an international company,
yes,
people applying from different countries, is there a difference within the cultural background of people?
Yes, the extent to which you acknowledge and incorporate expectations that might very well be understood or misunderstood culturally affects the perception of fairness. And so individuals whose names might be culturally different, whose age might be older, etc., are more likely to perceive that your process is unfair, unless you find some ways to counter that. So, for example, it's pretty common for most companies on their career site to show diversity within their employee culture fairly extensively, right? And in part, it's again appealing to that sense of fairness that we hire lots of different kinds of people here. We're looking for people based on their skills, etc., but from their culture, but their cultural backgrounds may be very different. And if there is, in fact, a strong approach that you must have a certain background in order to work in certain jobs, then that should be articulated very clearly.
Okay, Gerry, thank you very much for being with us, for being at this time, because it's 5 o'clock in Las Vegas at this moment. Thanks for sharing all your thoughts, your information about the candidate experience, especially in relationship to customers and the all experience companies are making. So this is this was the third webinar week webinar. I switch back naar het Nederlands. Dat klinkt heel raar, ik switch back. Maar hier ben ik weer in het Nederlands. Want we hebben om 2:30 het volgende webinar. Waarin Peter en Deborah ons meenemen in de beste candidate experience met content marketing en user experience design. Dus zij gaan heel erg diep in op hoe je je recruitment site kan optimaliseren aan de hand van content marketing en nou ja, de candidate experience design, hoe je dat kan optimaliseren. Mocht je het daarvoor nog niet hebben ingeschreven, dan kan dat nog steeds via werfn.nl/webinarweek. Ook vind je op werfn.nl artikelen die geschreven zijn naar aanleiding van de webinars. En kun je ook inschrijven voor andere dagen, want de rest van de week hebben we ook nog allerlei onderwerpen op het gebied van de arbeidsmarkt. En dat varieert dus van mobiliteit, woensdag, morgen over Total Workforce Management. Donderdag staan we stil bij HR en Flex. En vrijdag gaan we het hebben over recruitment, technologie en data. Ik hoop je later vandaag en anders in de week nog een keer te zien. Bedankt voor het kijken. En Gerry, nogmaals, thanks from out here. En we zien je graag een keer hier in Nederland.